Hello, everyone out there. How cool is this? I want to thank you all so much for joining us today on Zoom for a conversation about the New York Times bestselling book, Finish the Fight, the brave and revolutionary women who fought for the right to vote. Yes, it is time to celebrate the names and stories of these important historical women whose stories have really yet to be told. And what a fantastic panel we have today. I'm Maya Salam. I'm a culture editor at the New York Times, and I'm as excited as I know you all are to hear what these incredible panelists have to say. So without further ado, please let me welcome my friends and colleagues, all of whom had a very pivotal role in the creation of this project and book. First, we have Veronica Chambers. Hi, Veronica. She is the primary author and creator of Finish the Fight. She is also editor of narrative projects at the New York Times. We have Amy Padnani. Hi, Amy. Key contributor to Finish the Fight and an obituary editors at the Times, and also the creator of the Overlooked series. And Sandra Garcia, hello. Also a key contributor to this book and a New York Times reporter. While I'll be asking questions, of course, I encourage the panelists to please feel free to jump in and chat with one another at any time. And audience, please keep in mind that after the conversation, you'll have a chance to ask some questions. You can actually ask those questions now. Just drop them into the Ask a Question feature, which I think you should all be seeing there in the stream. Okay, let's get things started. Thank you, panelists, for joining me. This is awesome. So I think we'll just start with talking about, what the process for Finish the Fight was like, how it came together, how you wanted the writing process to reflect your goals with the book, and how they reflect your effort to broaden the lens of suffrage. Veronica, if you want to take that or get started there.
So when we realized that it was the 100th anniversary of women voting, which is something like a lot of us hadn't thought about. I mean, I think suffrage is kind of a boring word. And it's also a kind of problematic word because if you look in a lot of history books and you look at the term suffragist, you see a lot of, primarily white women and white dresses, and yet the story of women and voting rights in this country was so much bigger, so much more interesting. And we really wanted to tell that story. So we put together like kind of a posse of women writers, and we, set about to tell as many stories as we could about women who hadn't been talked about as much as we thought they should have.
That's great. Amy, so of course with Overlooked, you're certainly in.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I still remember emailing both of them because they're so busy and just saying, do you want to do this with me, please?
Definitely. So Amy, with Overlooked, you're kind of in the business of finding these names. So amongst all of you, how did you kind of decide that these were the women you really wanted to bring to the forefront and highlight?
Yeah, so as people may know or may not know, Overlooked is a history project that writes the obituaries for remarkable women and people of color who never got a New York Times obituary. So Finish the Fight fit right in with the work that I had already been doing. And I was really thrilled when Veronica reached out and asked me to contribute. Fortunately for me, she already had a long list of really interesting, fascinating women that were just open to exploration. And so I picked a couple of names. I spent hours and hours in the Schomburg Center at the New York Public Library researching. Thankfully, they have such a great collection. It was really tricky in some cases to find information on these women. And I find that a lot with Overlooked too. It's tricky to find information on somebody who died, up to a century ago. Yeah. And so that really was telling about how much these women's stories had been left out of the narrative of suffrage. And I really had to dig hard, but it was so important, I think, to be able to tell these tales. So.
Definitely. Sandra, what was that experience like for you? And, who were the women that you really wanted to bring to the forefront and why?
I wrote about Josephine Pierre St. Ruffin, and she's the first Black woman to own and operate a newspaper in the country. And I'm a reporter, and it just made sense. But also how she worked behind the scenes to help women, and how she used her, I guess, ability to pass as a white woman to then turn around and help the Black woman, help the groups that she was involved with, and put out that newspaper every as much as she did, and editorialize and do as much as she did for women of color, by using the fact that she passed, by using how light she was, and how people didn't actually question her her being in certain places, or question her knowing certain things. She was just fascinating. Is not something that I learned in school, and I definitely wanted to write about her.
That's for sure. Yeah, it is very interesting that she used this this sort of bridge that, you know, might come off or feel like fraught in some ways for the betterment overall.
Right. Yeah, no, her mother was an English woman, and her father was from Martinique. So she was white, but she definitely identified with the work that the Black women in this country were trying to do. She was aware that she was a rich, upper class kind of woman at the time. She could afford these really expensive dresses that a lot of people couldn't. But she definitely used that to bridge, to make a bridge between herself and her world, and the women that were trying to better themselves at the time.
Super interesting. Amy, it'd be great if you took a moment to talk about the chapters you worked on and what stories stood out to you. I would love to hear that.
Yeah, sure. Probably what stood out to me really was the tale of Ida B. Wells Barnett. We all know what a stellar journalist she was, a pioneering journalist who started many of the techniques of investigative journalism that are still used today. She, of course, started the campaign against lynching that was so effective and powerful. But people, I think, are less familiar with her involvement in the suffrage movement, which actually played a huge role in her life, particularly early on. She and later in life too. So as we all know, she ran a newspaper. She was a publisher. She wrote about lynching, but she also was part of several women's groups. She often had to force her way in. And there's a really good example that I highlight in the book about how the biggest march in Washington was taking place in, I believe it was 1913, or it might have been 1915. My facts are a little muddled in my head. But so she shows up. There are thousands of women who got off trains, who were there ready to march in Washington. And she goes to go with her delegation, and she's told by one of the white leaders of the march, actually, you have to go to the back, because we're afraid that if people see Black women involved, they might be less likely to support our movement overall. So why don't you just go ahead in the back? And she was furious. She said, hey, if we don't all do this together, we're not going to have the full power behind this effort. It's really key. And so they said, yeah, no, sorry. And so she had another plan. She said, fine. She left, and then she waited in the sidelines. And as her delegation marched past, she jumped in with them and marched just alongside them right in the front. So I was really impressed by her bravery all throughout her life. In those moments, she just wouldn't take no for an answer, and she stood up for what she believed in. So her story stood out to me the most. And I also worked on another chapter about Juno Frankie Pierce. She was an educator who had a similar situation, but it wasn't quite so bad. In fact, she was approached by a white suffrage leader in Tennessee. So now Tennessee at the time was a really key state in getting the 19th Amendment passed across the country. It was the last state that could have given the divisive vote. Decisive vote. And so there's this really heated moment where they're all sitting watching the vote happen. And lucky for her, she had been giving speeches. She had already partnered with a group of white women. and they had agreed, that we should work side by side. So she convinced them, and she wanted something in exchange. She wanted to open up a school for young Black women who were otherwise being sent to juvie. And so luckily, it passed. The whole room erupted into cheers, and Juno Frankie Pierce got her school for her young Black women, and probably helped an entire generation or several generations go on to success.
I think that's one of the
Amazing.
interesting things about suffrage, what Amy said, is that one, you sort of see that there's never just one movement happening at a time. Lynching, the anti-lynching movement is happening the same time as women's voting rights, as civil rights, as queer rights, as Native American land rights and citizenship rights. And so what you see among these women of color in suffrage is that they're taking on a lot of things at once. And they don't say, okay, we have to put aside our race issues so suffrage can pass. And part of what makes the movement successful is the ability to hold a multiplicity of movements.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're seeing that now today with what, we have racial justice movements and all these issues around parallels with voting rights and voting access and eligibility and disenfranchisement and all of this. So while we're talking about women's suffrage, because we're 100 years in here, I'm really seeing this with a wider lens. You can really see a lot of parallels. So Veronica, why is it important that we discuss these women and their motivations and impacts now? And what lessons can we stand to learn in facing our current challenges?
Well, the interesting thing is that 1920, you get the biggest influx of voters in American history because most women are given the right to vote. Though at that time, Asian American women and specifically Chinese American women didn't have the right to vote until later, and Native women don't get the right to vote till later. And there's a lot of turning away of the polls of Black women, but a lot of Black women vote. So you have this huge influx, almost half the population joins the ranks of voters. But what happens is our memories are very short as citizens. And so a few years later, what took 100 years to achieve, almost 100 years to achieve, the right for women to vote becomes something that's largely forgotten. You sort of think it's something we always have. And I think in a year like this, in 2020, it's so key to remember that voting unlocks everything. Everything that we want to happen in our society, everything we want to change, anything we want to preserve is connected to our vote and our right to vote. And so I think that is part of our work in suffrage, is not just looking back, but saying this right is power. And the reason why people didn't want you to have it is because they want to disconnect you from your power.
Yes, exactly. Sandra, did you want to speak to that at all?
Veronica pretty much nailed it. These women were not just involved in the suffrage movement. Josephine was also involved in the anti-lynching movement. She also worked with different women's clubs and started the Women's Era Club for the betterment of women of color and the education of women of color. But yeah, Veronica nailed it. The only reason why someone would try to disenfranchise you or keep you from voting is to keep you from exercising your power as a citizen. Sorry about that. Josephine actually wrote a lot of letters in her newspaper that she edited about why the importance of women being able to vote, especially in that moment, but not just white women, but also Black women. It again came down to making sure that the proper people were being, not proper, but that everyone was being heard and that they could vote and exercise their voice as citizens.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I'd like to ask you all this, and whoever would like to take a stab at it first. But speaking about this, what would you all say is at stake for women voters today? I mean, does it continue to be useful to consider women voters as a monolith in any regard?
I think this is interesting because Jenny Schuessler, we have two co-authors who are on this call, Jenny Schuessler and Jen Harlan. And Jenny Schuessler's done a lot about suffrage and history. And, from the very beginning, there's kind of the myth of the woman voter. And women have never agreed on everything, but that doesn't mean that our vote as women is not important. And, you can find all our coverage on suffrage on nytimes.com/suffrage. But one of the pieces that Jenny did was about conservative women and the women who were anti the vote. And if you look at the sort of arc of history, what's so interesting is that it's not that these women didn't have opinions about child labor laws and women's rights and domestic violence and all these kind of issues that are bubbling up at the turn of the century. There was this feeling that politics was a blood sport and that women, the conservative women of that time, early 19th century, early 20th century, late 19th century, really felt that women could better exercise their power outside the halls of Washington. They did not win that fight. Women got the vote. But I think there's always a question about what do we believe as women? Where do we think we should put our energy and our power? And I think the thing that you see in the suffrage movement is that put it somewhere. You know what I mean? No one's saying you have to vote for this person or that person, or you have to support this issue because you're a woman. But if you're an American who is lucky enough to have the right to vote, it is something that generations of women fought for. Only one woman who was at Seneca Falls lived to vote in 1920. She was a teenager at Seneca Falls in 1848, and she lived to vote in 1920. So that means women who started the right to vote in the early 1800s, who started that fight, they had children, they had daughters, they died, their daughters took up the fight. Some of those daughters died. 3 generations of women fought for it, not knowing whether or not they were going to get it. So I think it's less important what we do as a block of women and more important that we realize that all kinds of women contributed to this fight, and we need all kinds of women to get to the polls and think for themselves and show up and show out, like Kimberly Crenshaw says,
Yes. Amy, do you have any thoughts on that or anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that hits on a lot of really key notes. It's such an independent individual right, the right to vote. And I think the way women had been disenfranchised a century ago really speaks to this sort of grouping and stereotyping that was forced upon us, that, women don't have the brains or, the gut or the instinct, or, if it's a blood sport, I guess, the wherewithal to tolerate what goes on in politics. But it's, as we just talked about with the layers of complexity in each woman's story, everybody has different passions and ideas and beliefs. And so it is really an independent individual thing that I agree with Veronica, we should all exercise in some way.
Yeah. And can I just jump in and say something interesting that I thought we found was that, there was a woman named Mary Walker who was a civil War era surgeon. And she met her husband in medical school. They opened a practice together. This is, decades before women get the right to vote. They end up closing the practice because people don't want to go to a practice with a woman doctor. But from the time she was on the battlefields of the Civil War, tending to soldiers until when she was in surgery for hours, she didn't want to wear the petticoats and the skirts and all that stuff. She would get arrested for wearing pants. And the law said that you could be arrested for wearing men's clothes. And this is a woman who's a trained doctor. And she's saying, I'm not wearing men's clothes. I'm wearing my clothes and what fits me and the job that I'm doing. And that's the power of the vote. Like the fact is that if we don't utilize our vote, if we don't have a vote, it is everything. It's literally the right to wear pants as well as anything else. I mean, all of these things were law, not that long ago. I mean, my great grandmother was alive at that time. So I think we have to remember it's not just the big issues that divide us, but really the letter of the law affects every part of our lives. And that's why these women fought so hard, because they knew that you couldn't have a bank account, you couldn't own property, you couldn't, apply for a job. All the women that we see in Congress, we look at the women of the 118th, women couldn't run for office if women couldn't vote, so very few women had leadership positions in our country in government before 1920. So it all connects back, and it's all about possibility and opportunity and knowing that we all count. Because the other thing, I'm talking a lot, I'm so passionate
Oh,
about
please,
it.
I love this.
Turning to a suffrage
Talk.
nerd, but the other thing, we met with a lot of historians to talk about it. And one thing they told us really early on is they said, yeah, you can pick a Josephine Pierre St. Ruffin or an Ida B. Wells or Mary Church Terrell or Zikala Sa or Hovida Dar, but they were like, heroes don't make movements, people do. So really what made suffrage possible, what got us the vote, were all these women who saved 5 cents from their family budget to pay for the women's era and get these newspapers, who bought pins, who helped support women going to marches. And so it's the everyday people that change the world. And suffrage is just another example of that.
Yeah, I think with every passing year, as I get older, I realize that when we are taught history, we learn it at such a young age. And sometimes that's the only time we ever hear about it. And things seem so far away. And even, you're taught the civil rights movement, and, I was born in 1980. That's only about a decade before, but it's taught to me like it could have been 200 years before. And as you get older, you realize how recent these things are. I mean, why is it important for young people, both boys and girls, to understand the history of women's suffrage movement? Like, what should children really know about this, and why is this important? And I feel like this book, by the way, which I've already sent to my nieces who are young teens, that's step one for me. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sandra, I know you have a nephew, right?
Yes, I have 2 nephews, Miles and Cameron. I also sent them copies, and Cameron is 4, so he's not at all interested. No, he's 3, and Miles is 5, so he's excited to read the book with his mom. But what I was gonna say, Maya, about what you were saying, it's important for boys and girls to learn about these women, because they need to understand that you can come from anywhere, any walk of life. You can be, like Josephine, who was a widow. She was a biracial woman of good, I guess, not good standing, but she was not poor. She wasn't wealthy, but she had enough money to take care of herself and start the women's era, and start and be able to pay women that contributed to the women's era newspapers. And even though towards the end of the run for the newspaper, she had to, try to get as many people to buy ads in the paper to be able to finance it, she tried her best. And I think these are all stories about women who gave their best, women who didn't take no for an answer, women who educated one another and worked off of each other, right? Courageous women like Ida B. Wells. And I think that these stories are what inspire children. And yeah, it's taught to us like this was 100 years ago, right? And when you're 8 or 9, it feels like 100 years ago, especially when you see these photos. They're in black and white, or they're very, antique-like. And I understand that children may feel like, this is just something I have to learn to understand the history. But it may very well inspire those kids. It may very well make them feel that no matter where they come from, or no matter what is standing in their way, they can also create change in the world and stand up for what they believe in. And especially in a year like this year, and the kind of state of affairs, I guess, of the country, where there's so much social unrest. I'm sure that there are parents explaining to their kids why there have been protests in every state in the country. Why the people are protesting against police. All of these issues are directly tied with the suffrage movement, the anti-lynching movement. These are not, these movements didn't happen in a vacuum. They're all connected. And to find it easier to explain to a child, like, this is what happened in women's suffrage, this is what this woman had to do, and she went around, Ida B. Wells went around documenting rapes and documenting lynches by the authorities at the time. If it is easier, I guess it makes it easier in my mind, because I haven't had to explain this to a child yet, to be able to say, look, this is what was going on then. We had a little bit of progress. And this is how it's directly tied to the protests you see on TV today. Suffrage is not, oh, great, you know, women got the right to vote, and that's it. It's all tied together. And those stories of those women who, you know, tried their best, did the best they could to get us that vote, still resonate today. We see those women all the time, leading marches, leading protests. We see them all the time. They're the mothers of the people who have been unfortunately killed by police or anything like that, or having to deal with any sort of police brutality. Those mothers can then turn around and decide to fight against police brutality. It's the same thing that all of these women did. And that's why I think it's still relevant. History is not ever a one-off in history. Everything is intrinsically connected.
Yes, thank you. So true. And I think what you said about, yes, Amy, please.
I learned this kind of on a daily basis, actually, as an obituaries editor, because the people who die, of course, their heydays were decades ago, and they were fighting for something that they believed in, or they changed society or the world in some way. And it's always kind of, it's a daily like shock almost. For instance, not too long ago, I was editing the obituary for a woman who was really central to the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s. And I read about all the things that she's talking about. She was one of the first people in her circles to talk about the intersection of gender and race, for instance, and how important. She's like, unless we fight with those two things together, we're not going to achieve much. And I thought, oh, we're still having that same conversation today. You know, it's really crazy. And then in the suffrage movement 100 years ago, we were having this conversation. So it's a constant reminder of how things have changed, but still how much more we have left to do. And I feel like that is kind of an important lesson to share. I mean, history is cyclical in a way, to share with younger readers that, this is going to come up in your life at some point. And here are some women and how they dealt with it and how they tolerated the injustices and what they made from that. And some of them were actually quite young. You know, Ida B. Wells was 16 when both of her parents died, and she had to take care of her younger siblings and become a school teacher. And then she was harassed all along the way. And so sometimes they were as young as some of the readers that we're addressing here. And what was the other thing I was going to add? It was, think about the fact that we haven't had a female president yet of our nation. The fact that we won the right to vote 100 years ago and we still don't have a female president says a lot about how much more there is left for us to do.
Very well put. Yes, indeed. Veronica, did you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, Amy and I have worked together several times on overlooked related projects. And I do think that, you know, you talk about why people should write their own obituary. I think working on these profiles, it makes you think like, what is the measure of your life? Like, what do you stand for? What do you believe in? I mean, I was wondering, Amy, if you could talk about how people have been inspired by overlooked profiles and stories like the ones in this book to make changes in their own life. Like, what do you hear?
Yeah, absolutely. Talking about legacy, that's something that I think a lot of people should think about more, really, is recording one's own legacy. When Overlooked first launched, I heard from a lot of people who said they felt seen for the first time in a long time. It's so clear that our society kind of devalues women and people of color still to this day, and that we have to sort of really fight hard to have our voices heard. We have to fight kind of internal battles sometimes to convince ourselves that our voices are worth hearing. And then we have to fight against society to make sure they hear them once we've found the strength. So in all the talks I give, I encourage people to write about themselves. You may not even think that you've done something interesting or remarkable or worth sharing, but believe me, there could be somebody a century from now who's looking for you because they were inspired by something they read about you, one sentence, one factoid, and they want to know, where were you born? Who were your parents? What was your life like? And so I just encourage, especially women and people of color, but everybody, write it down somewhere in a letter to yourself, to a next of kin, to a friend, to a relative, StoryCorps, record an oral history or something. Just put it out there, and it doesn't matter how old you are, you can always add to it later.
Mhm. And on that note, I know that, reporting on historical figures, it can be very challenging, and, you have to dig up letters and old documents. I'd love to hear about the research for this project and how much had to go into it in order to feel like you were putting forth the most accurate picture and depiction of these women's lives.
Yeah, I mean, the research was momentous. It was really a huge effort. And what we did is we really started we sent out an email survey to dozens of historians who write about women's history and suffrage. And we said, what don't we know about suffrage? What do you wish people knew? Why does it matter now? And then we got so much back, and it was great to start with people who've done the work. I think, Sandra's a reporter, and one of the great things about being a journalist is you get to ask smart people the questions. And so we started that way. And then we actually had a roundtable at the New York Times with, I think it was 8 historians. And we started at 9 o'clock in the morning, and we were still there at 5 o'clock, and we taped everything. And then we kind of went back to that. And from there, we created a reading list and files and articles and files on each of the women we decided to focus on. We have a great person on our team, Nick Donofrio, who has a PhD, and he compiles these amazing files. So it was really great to do that. And it was great for me to go back to books that I read in college with the fresh eye, like When and Where I Enter by Paula Giddings, as well as to read things that I hadn't read before, like Why We Marched by Susan Ware, and Martha Jones has an amazing book about Black women and voting rights called Vanguard. Can I go off topic and say one other thing about Amy mentioned?
Go for it.
Amy mentioned that we haven't had a female president. And one of the things that I really was hoping to do in the book, but I couldn't because it's a little tricky, but I wanted to look at when women got the vote in different countries and when they first had a women head of state. It turns out it's really not that easy to make a simple pie chart or graph of that. But if you think about the fact that African American men were granted the vote in 1870 and Barack Obama was elected in 2008, that is 148 years after Black men get the vote that a Black man enters the highest office in the land. If you think about the fact that women have been voting 100 years, it makes you realize that it feels like a long time ago, but in the history of a country, it's actually a relatively short time. And I'm just hoping with all my heart that it's not going to be 146 years before a woman gets into the office, but it just I think history gives you a perspective. It makes you see time as both short and long. And so
Indeed.
I think that's something important to think about, that again, why it was so important that we get the vote so that we could, Emmeline Pankhurst, the British suffragist, when suffragists were getting, arrested and, thrown into prison and were on these starvation diets, these hunger strikes, she said, we're not breaking the law to break the law. We're breaking the law because we want to be lawmakers. And that's something that I think women are still trying to achieve in this country, all throughout every bit of office.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I just want to do a quick aside to the audience. I'm going to be taking some audience questions probably in about 10 minutes. So please feel more than free to drop your questions into either the chat or ask a question feature there. And I will take a look at those shortly. Sandra, what was this research like for you? What were some of the challenges and what did you feel like the process was like for you?
I was lucky because the Women's Era, that newspaper, there was a lot of it up online, and I could go through the letters that she wrote as an editor for her paper, and they were very, they really had her voice, and I could hear her almost when she's, writing about.
You're on mute, Sandra.
Oh,
Sorry about that. When she wrote about, asking women around the country to come and help out with her newspaper, when she condemned certain women's clubs for not allowing Black women to be part of it. Because she was also part of a lot of white only women's clubs. And she wrote about that, and she basically made a call to arms to all women around the country that were getting her paper. So I got lucky that paper, because she began publishing it in 1893. So I got lucky that her paper was still up, and I could still kind of get a touch of her bravado, I guess, from that. But not a lot has been written about Josephine. I got, again, lucky that I could find snippets of her work in other books. So that was daunting, because it was like maybe half a chapter about Josephine, and I had to pair all of those together to kind of form a picture of her life. So it wasn't that difficult. I was just very grateful that she took it upon herself, especially towards the and like the last days of her newspaper. She took it upon herself to write to Black women in her voice, and she wasn't always right. She wasn't always kind and compassionate. She did sometimes ask women to do things that they couldn't do because they didn't have the kind of money that she had. For example, saying that a cake is perfectly priced at $1.50 when almost no one had $1.50 in 18, especially not a Black woman, right? And she did that a lot. But yeah, the research was it was a lot. Again, like how Amy said, because she died so long ago, she lived so long ago, but again, like she documented everything that she did, and she wrote letters to so many women, letters to people that she wanted to ask to take out ads for her paper. She even asked for donations for the paper with letters, and that was extremely helpful. So Amy's right, document everything you do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I will say one of my favorite research tools was finding newspapers of the day that somebody lived, especially a lot of Black newspapers like the Afro-American. There are like hundreds of other small Black newspapers all over the country. Also some of the local New York press, it came in really handy with Mabel Penghua Lee, for instance, who was an immigrant from China who got involved in the suffrage movement largely in Chinatown, which was something, immigrants didn't do. You just, blend in, work hard, that's about it. And she said, no, I think women here and in China should have the right to vote, have the right to an education, be able to do all of these things that men get to do. And so at the age of 16, she led, at the time, one of the biggest marches in the country in New York City. So there were a lot of newspaper articles about this, that, the little Chinese girl who stood up against her own parents and decided she was going to be in this movement. Those came in very, very handy. Unfortunately, we still couldn't get simple things like her full date of birth, but we learned a lot about her personality for sure through these clippings.
Love that. So, as we're telling these stories of these different women, I think one of the most, the loveliest things about this book, and one of the most remarkable, is that even though we're discussing different women in different places, coming from different perspectives, it is all tied together, and it does paint this bigger picture when it was assembled. So, that's kind of one of those things that might seem seamless when you're reading, but I'm sure on the back end was quite a bit of work. So, how did the contributors come together to work on this? How was it assembled to, kind of paint this bigger picture?
Yeah, I think that we all took different chapters to work on. And then we sort of sat together and worked on the through line. Like we worked on the intro a lot. We worked on the conclusion. We went to pay tribute to the historians. So when Carrie Chapman Catt, who created what was called the winning plan, that got the 36 states to ratify the 19th Amendment and it became law. When she retired, she actually she built in her backyard what she called a suffrage forest. And on every tree, she put a plaque, the name of a woman who had helped move the movement forward. And so in the back of the book, we had an illustrator do an illustration of a forest, and we put the name of all the historians whose books we had loved the most. And the book was illustrated by 11 young women illustrators, and they were all women of color and or queer women. And that was really important to us too, to be able to have the diversity of the illustrators reflect the, the breadth of the book, as well as the diversity of the authors and the contributors. So it was a big train with a lot of people on it, but we were all really headed to the same place, which is to tell the story of women in voting in as broad a way as possible.
Definitely. The illustrations are stunning. They are so cool, and definitely, when we talk about how we learn about these things when we're young, we might get, a tiny thumbnail picture and 3 paragraphs and a history book somewhere, but to have this in color, these large illustrations is so beautiful and such a great way to communicate these stories. Okay. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and then I will take a look at the chat here and see what, Amy, go on.
Question, Maya?
Yes.
So early in this talk, Veronica mentioned just how varied this movement was, and a lot of the things that we haven't learned or ever heard about. And I know you've written about queerness in the history of the suffrage movement. I'm wondering if you can tell everybody a little bit more about that and what you learned.
Yes, I was very lucky to contribute to the New York Times' effort to share stories and tell a broader, more accurate picture of the women's suffrage movement. And one component of that is, the idea of queerness within the suffrage movement. And I think we're talking about some of the biggest names in the movement, including Susan B. Anthony and actually, I do have it pulled up. Sorry, I wasn't 100% ready to be asked that question, but but I do. Thank you for asking. Alice Dunbar Nelson, Carrie Chapman Catt, Anna Howard Shaw. I mean, these are all some of the bigger names in the movement, and all of them, all of the women I just named, had relationships with women, romantic relationships, and including Lucy Anthony, Susan B. Anthony's niece, and it's such a, the way these women lived is so important to understanding what we're talking about here, because it isn't like these women all of them lived in this little box of being, straight white women married to men and then doing this as like a side hobby. These women were living radically. They were, even the ones who weren't perhaps in relationships with women, they still were living outside the bounds of what was acceptable for a woman and what was expected of them. And I think it just is the accurate portrayal of what was happening. And to live in this way where you are outside of the norm, and especially if you're in a relationship with women. I mean, even nowadays, I myself am married to a woman. Even in 2020, you have to take all these considerations into account, whether it be your safety or where you're going or the amount of affection you show and where. And for me to realize that these women who were so brave and so bold and fighting for something so concrete were also living so radically is not only empowering and brings up so many feelings in me, it just also shows me how much I didn't understand. And I think that's what all of this is about on some degree, is just accepting that we weren't taught things properly and fully, and now is our chance to fix that. And yeah, it was wonderful. And same with the research. I think that the letters that these women wrote to each other are, I mean, I don't know if anyone goes through my emails in 100 years, if they're going to be so beautifully written and inspiring, but, you know, to be able to hear their voice, see how they communicated and shared their truths with each other is so beautiful. And I found being part of the project at the Times and learning about this was everything to me. It was one of my favorite things I've ever done. Thanks for asking, Amy.
That's what you said about their lives, because I really think, just to go back again to the idea that suffrage is a boring word, but this work is anything but, is that the relevance to 2020 is what these women were asking for 100 years is, what does it mean to be a woman and live free? What does it mean to be a Black person and live free? What does it mean to be Indigenous and live free? You know, like all of these questions. And I think that these are questions we're still wrestling with today. And I think that for me, there's a lot of hope in going into this work, because you realize that they were, you know, lynching was as bad, if not worse, than what we're dealing with now. So if our foremothers could, like, you know, chin up and buckle up and keep fighting, then we have to do the same. I know that we're short on time, so I don't know if you want to ask a question.
Oh, go ahead and finish your thought. I mean, I will certainly, I'm only seeing a couple of thoughts. Oh, wait, I do have a couple of questions here. I guess we can, maybe it's a good time then to pivot to viewer questions. One of them is from Danielle. How old do you think most young people who may be disconnected from this history are? Do you think it's people in their 30s or younger? So as far as, you know, when you think about the disconnection from the reality of the suffrage movement, do you think that this is across the board? Do you think it affects younger people more? Do you think we learn more as we get older? Or yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
I can jump in and say that I think that one of the hard things, I don't think it's a generational thing. I think it's how history was taught. And I think one of the reasons why we didn't learn suffrage history, because we're not taught women's history. And we didn't learn a fuller suffrage history, I think because generations before us really didn't want to reckon with the messiness of the history. That women like Susan B. Anthony were both heroes and they were really exclusionary. So I almost think, like, before the moment that we're in, and you know, some academics have been working on this for years, but as a public journalism project, it really coincides with the question of being able to hold complexity and hold exclusionary practices in a way that I think previous generations were really uncomfortable with. They really wanted to hold on to heroes, or they didn't learn as much about women as they could have.
Absolutely. Yes, very well put. And one more question here. I think we have time for one more. Urvashi writes, it's been 100 years since women got the right to vote, but still today, women of color and minorities still don't go out and vote. What's the take on that? Sandra, do you want to chime in on that first?
Well, my question would be, they don't go out and vote, or things keep them from voting? You know, is it a choice that they're making that they don't want to go out and vote, or are they thinking, I can't, you know, skip work to stand online for 3 hours, or I have no one to watch my, so I don't know which one this person is referring to, but yeah, it's a shame that people don't exercise their right. Like I said earlier, it is the one way citizens can use their power, use their voice to shape their communities and shape the world and the country that we live in. So it not only for, like Veronica said, not only because of the struggles that our foremothers went through, but also the men that fought, you know, before them, and the men that continue to fight after them. Voting is something, like Veronica said, that so many people, so many generations have fought for, have lost their lives fighting for, you know, have been, you know, in horrible condition have had to face incredible adversity to be able to secure the vote, and to not exercise that right is unfortunate. As far as people that are being disenfranchised in whatever way, or that have been disenfranchised historically, we have also seen people like John Lewis who would not take disenfranchisement by any means. He did everything he could to be able to secure the vote for Black people. There have been, just like there have been movements to be able to give people of color and women the right to vote, there have been women to allow us to express that without retaliation, without having someone stop us, or arbitrary means of choosing who gets to vote, or things like that. And I think that speaks volumes to what is important to the people of this country, when they're not only fighting for their right, but they're fighting for their right to exercise that right. And so it is unfortunate when people don't vote. It is unfortunate when there are certain scenarios and situations that keep people from being able to go vote. But I stand in the solid truth that it is one of our biggest rights. It is, so many people have died trying to get us that right. Millions of people come to this country just to be able to have that right, to be able to say, I want to choose the Attorney General where I live. It is a privilege, and it should be seen as such.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And thank you, Amy and Veronica. That was such a treat, and that went by really, really fast. So, and that's it for us today. So audience, thank you so much as well for tuning in. This has been amazing. And I appreciate everyone carving out an hour of their day to be here with us. So yes, take care.